All right. So let's see. We were talking about ACEs, and there looks to be some kind of weird squares. Anyway, maybe that's just on my end. Do you see the squares over the slides? Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, are they the little gray squares?
Yeah.
yeah. Is that just a
Okay,
quirk?
sorry. Yeah, that's my controls panels, but it should trying to move
Go
them.
away. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's
There
okay.
you go.
Cool. Yeah, they'll disappear. In any case, this is childhood experiences. So your ACE score, and then you can see the likelihood of reporting a rape, of having a sexual assault, a rape, in the higher number of ACE scores, and in particular, four or more, very much jumping up to that over 30% rate. So sexual violence is connected to other types of violence. And I think this is a really good example of how you can really see that. Um, yeah. All right, next slide. So things that we do know about, now that we do know about ACEs and the impacts that these experiences can have on us, it makes it all the more necessary to be really intentional about what can be done in order to combat that. What can be done to mitigate some of these effects? And a lot of them are going to maybe sound kind of superficial, but actually it's in these self-regulating, supporting the body in regulating its own electrochemical responses to, like, super nerd out there. It really is acknowledging, hey, body, you've been under this extreme stress condition, and maybe multiple times over the course of life, most likely. And so being needing that rest and recuperation and the fuel that is needed in order to undo the harm, the damage caused by intense stress responses like that, especially if they're prolonged. So really, truly sleeping, getting movement into your life, interjecting that on a daily basis, moving around, getting your heart rate up, some kind of exercise, eating well, what you put in your body, have that be nourishing, and be sure that you're getting enough nourishment. Even if you think that you eat too much, sometimes it's not actually the case, and we do need to have certain nutrients. We could probably do a whole talk on all of these types of things, but also mindfulness practices, meditation, different ways to contemplate and be present, be in the moment on purpose, without judgment and attachment. And we'll talk about that in the afternoon as well. Mental health, of course, I'm coming in as a mental health provider. So really underscoring the importance of that, whether you seek out and get the support of a professional or do things on your own. There's a ton of, actually, I think that there is, in fact, more quality content out there on the internet these days, as opposed to fluff stuff or things that I maybe wouldn't necessarily say is based in science. So anyway, it's all out there, and consult your local therapist if you have a question. And then also being able to create and start and have healthy relationships might be more work if that has not been in repertoire, if that's not been the pattern, that hasn't been in the family, and there's maybe not a lot of experiences to look off of and see. But healthy relationships are possible for everybody, whether you've been the victim or the perpetrator of traumatic experiences, of sexual violence, of other forms of abuse and neglect. That change is possible, and you can, and it's really never too late in your life to be able to adjust that, because our body is incredibly resilient, and so is our mind, and relationships can heal, and there is hope out there. It's not a throwaway.
I would just add to think about how difficult accomplishing some of this might be when you have a newborn, or when you have multiple children running around that you're trying to care for, when it can be pretty hard to get quality sleep, and maybe you're not getting the type of exercise or nutrition or opportunities to engage in these stress reducing, resilience building activities. And I think in your interactions with clients and patients, this is a lot of what you're emphasizing, right? How to help people build in time to make sure that this is what is a bigger part of their day, because of how it can be so buffering to some of the consequences of having high stress. So this is an ongoing conversation for ourselves included, right? About how do we make sure that we're getting all of these types of supports. But I think it's a good reminder that just because harm was done to developing brains and to our bodies, it doesn't stop there. But we need to help prioritize and make sure people have time to implement these activities. Next slide. All right, so this is where we're gonna share this video that outlines what we're talking about with the impact of toxic stress and high levels of cortisol that run through our bodies, and how that impacts the nature of our DNA itself.
Genetic code, our genome, from our parents. Our genome is like an instruction manual made up of thousands of genes that tell our bodies how to grow and develop. But our experiences throughout life influence the way our bodies read and react to this instruction manual. And this is where epigenetics comes into play. Epigenetics is the study of how behaviors, environments, and our life experiences can affect the way our genes work. Just like the switches in an electrical box, our genes can be turned on and off. Some of our genes act as master switches. These genes can switch other genes on or off. Some genes have dynamic switches. These genes switch on and off frequently, like genes that exhibit a circadian rhythm and express changes over a predictable 24-hour cycle. Still, other genes have stable switches. These genes remain on or off throughout life. Epigenetics shows that social and environmental stimuli, the people, places, and things that a person interacts with, can switch certain genes on or off, altering the way our brains and bodies read our genetic code. And these epigenetic changes can have lasting impacts on our health, development, and behaviors. So, what does this mean in relation to ACEs? We now know that early childhood experiences can result in epigenetic changes. This helps explain why early adversity is linked to poor health outcomes and risky behaviors. When a child's environment is filled with adversity, epigenetic changes can cause certain genes to switch on or off, impacting their developmental and health trajectories in negative ways. Epigenetics helps us understand that even though genes play a role, they don't determine exact outcomes. For instance, a child may inherit genes that predispose them to depression or obesity, but that part of their genetic code may never be expressed if their environment does not cause that gene to switch on. ACEs and toxic stress can cause certain genes to switch on, enabling potentially harmful traits to be expressed. And when harmful traits are expressed, the likelihood that a person will experience long-term negative outcomes increases. Epigenetic changes have implications for the health and well-being of individuals and for future generations, as evidence suggests that some epigenetic changes can be passed from generation to generation. However, our genes are not our destiny. When we intervene at the earliest moment, we have the power to prevent epigenetic factors from taking hold. We can reverse negative outcomes associated with ACEs and break the cycle of intergenerational trauma.
Please feel free to put in the chat any thoughts you have from that video. And I'm also curious if this is a new area for you, or if you've been learning and working with what we know about epigenetics in your own fields. Was that a helpful explanation of what we're sharing here? And a preventative tool, absolutely. It's a area that more and more people are learning about and paying attention to. Yeah, something new, but trauma infiltrates all aspects of life and being, absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense for the moms that you're working with. Good. Yeah, I think it's a pretty it's a good way to help raise awareness with the public in general, even if people aren't, doing this type of work. Very good. Thank you. Next slide. So here in California, our former Surgeon General's name is Nadine Burke-Harris, who was a pediatrician up in the Bay Area, who really grabbed a hold of what we know from the ACEs research and wanted to make it more accessible to the public, wanted to get more people using the ACE tool, the questionnaire, as a screening tool, not a diagnostic, but a screening tool. And wanted to be able to help more providers use it as a tool and then be reimbursed by insurance for it. And so part of that effort was this whole ACEs Aware campaign to provide more training and opportunity about what learning more about the history of ACEs for people requires us to do in terms of how do we connect them to the more appropriate types of resources that they may need. And the Surgeon General's office, put out this report just a couple years ago called the Roadmap to Resilience Report, which you can find online. But here, I thought this was just another good kind of infographic to really document the way that the stress impacts the biology, and then how we see those biological changes in people's behavior through the ways that they're using substances, or what their diet or their exercise levels look like. And also shows here, for what the work you're doing, how the impact of those interruptions to the biological and physical development of children, particularly when pregnant mothers are experiencing high stress, and what that does to the developing baby, and then also during the sensitive periods throughout your youth development. So we want to think about how are we tying this all together holistically, looking at how the impact of stress and trauma impacts our minds, our bodies, our spirits. And so this is one of the ways to help kind of continue to connect those dots. Next slide. And then part of what we want to think about with the focus today is what's happening for parents who have trauma histories. How is the reliving of difficult memories impacting them? How is the maybe the memories that are and visceral reactions that are coming up from having particular exams and procedures done that are needed throughout their pregnancy, maybe triggering memories of the abuse, again, brain and body memories. So our goal is to help identify when these situations have occurred, and then how those behaviors and those responses are normal and appropriate brain and body responses to stress and trauma. And then better understand some of the behaviors that we're seeing in people that isn't somebody trying to be difficult, isn't someone refusing help, but someone who's really struggling because they may not understand where these behaviors and beliefs are coming from that are actually trauma responses. So we want to look at what's happening with ACEs for parents. And then again, if those ACEs aren't being identified and treatments appropriate treatments made available, then those patterns are going to remain. And that's where we see the intergenerational transmission. Again, can be interrupted, but does have significant development of brain and body impacts. Next slide. So a reminder here that when sexual violence occurs, it's not only the violation of the individual, but the violation of society as a whole. And thinking about the damage that sexual violence does to social relationships. This is a picture of a book by Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, who's up at Pepperdine, who's done an excellent job of, again, looking at how do we empower, how do we help survivors maintain and regain a sense of control? How do we do that through talk therapies and through other types of, again, figuring out ways to release trauma from our bodies through dance, through art, through time in nature are all some opportunities. And I think the importance here is to think about shame and isolation are common hallmarks of experiences for survivors. So when we're thinking about how are we supporting hope and healing, and helping people believe that healing is possible, we really need to think about our response to trauma as a community being an important ingredient in the support for all of those types of healing that are needed. Next slide.
Taisha raised her hand if you want to.
Yes, go ahead, Taisha.
I'm sorry, just really quick. I was thinking about some of our clients and just wondering if you can share just the difficulty of when a minor has, as a result of the sexual violence, ends up pregnant and they have parents who struggle or may not see that this violence actually happened and it's affected that child. And the expectation is now that their parent, they need to grow up. So they kind of, it's really hard in home visiting where you have the client,
Yes.
but.
And what is your name?
Someone has their, but you have the parent of the client that's a minor that feels differently. Just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit, because it's not just the mom, especially if they're minor, and if they're coming from a different culture or background that do not see this. Now you're a parent, grow up, get over it. This is your child.
Yeah, Jessica, you want to go first?
Oh yeah, no,
Sorry.
no, it's
great question.
Yeah, and this is real life, right? Like these are the clients these are the folks that we're working with, and these are their stories. And if I was not a therapist, I would think like refer family, refer, teen mom, I'll refer all of the things. And then I think to work with, it's kind of like walking this middle of how do I honor the family and where they're coming from, and that I don't know everything in this family's system. And also being able to honor and kind of like bring in education of what is it that the teen mother, the person who's carrying the unborn child and is pregnant, regardless of their age, I think is also like having, how do you have those conversations? It might be like nonchalant, slipped in every now and again. Maybe there's an opening where you do have a real question. Some of the tips we'll go over in the afternoon of like either making a referral or like how do you ask the difficult questions. are yeah, it's like, okay, is this my place to be saying this? Am I going to be saying this and it's going to come across as like insulting or invalidating? Or am I going to be able to say this thing and maybe it won't feel good to the adult parent, but to the minor parent, maybe it's going to be really relieving to actually hear someone in their corner and be like, oh, this person actually understands where I'm coming from. And like, I'm a kid still, and I am not ready to grow up like that. Yeah, that's a lot of different dynamics that are going to be bigger than probably, however long you're assigned with the family. But yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of this goes back to education and us as appropriate in our roles to be planting some of those seeds of other considerations, right? Like, yes, the responsibility still needs to be there, but better understanding some of the responses to trauma, better helping people better recognize that it's not an obstinate child or a difficult child. It's a child experiencing trauma. And you can't expect certain things. You can't just keep piling on the trauma brain and the trauma body and expect there not to be, difficulties there. So I think it's about opening up those conversations, not that it's challenging the parent, but more in a way of helping them see, I kind of see so-and-so's behavior there, as an example of the trauma that she's experienced, and looking at ways to reinforce helping with that, in addition to how that will promote ability to be more, to be able to learn how to be a responsible parent.
Thank you for sharing. Just lastly, and I'm gonna stop talking. So
No, you're good.
I think what's also challenging in the work that we do is you have people or families that don't see trauma as is valid.
Yep.
And for some, culturally, it's not a thing. It's like, whatever, I got through it, you need to. And so it becomes very weighty for home visitors to try to navigate and provide service in a compassionate way. And you have a very assertive parent who does not feel like you should be babying. And I know there's home visitors on here that can attest to that. That is a very hard place to be.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And that underscores thinking about cultural humility as an ongoing education and a self-reflection, personally and professionally, right? Because we can't just walk in and say, you should be doing it this way, or you should believe it as I believe it. And I think it is looking at how do we grow beyond the rigidity that is often there, and how parents, families, cultures are kind of restricting what we need as people, just as individuals. I'm feeling it different than you're feeling it, and trying to create opportunity with sensitivity and humility to say, this is another way of looking at it, and this is some of what I'm hearing from so and so and so and so, to just keep planting those seeds. I absolutely agree with you. I was spanked as a child, so I don't see a problem with spanking sort of mentality, right, is the same sort of challenge. So sharing research, sharing stories, sharing survivor experiences and perspectives is a big way of adding to that understanding.
And a really brief note, I think if using their language, and I think like broadening it of like, oh, I think this might be another way to think of this, or with this experience, this is sometimes what I've seen in the work I do, rather than saying, oh, this is definitely trauma. Right, which I don't think that's what you were saying, but yeah, the use of whatever language that they are using to talk about an experience, to roll with that as like a pathway to.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So we put together some examples here from just some of the high profile cases. Some of these are actually fairly old, but in terms of starting to look more at how society responds to sexual violence, the ways that we contribute to people not feeling safe to report because we blame them. You shouldn't have been there. You shouldn't have been wearing that. You shouldn't have been drinking this. A lot of the focus goes on the survivor instead of the focus being put and the responsibility being put on the person actually perpetuating the harm. You might remember when the allegations against Bill Cosby first came out. It was shocking for a lot of people. People couldn't imagine someone like Bill Cosby, this father figure, this really also important cultural figure, doing this to people. And the woman, the next to the empty chair, 2 seats over there in the picture, is a survivor of Bill Cosby, who spoke at one of our summits and talked about just that it was so hard to come forward because it was discrediting this person that was really idolized culturally and societally. And the importance of this picture here on the cover of New York Magazine, with just how many people did come forward, as well as the empty chair representing all of the victims that are never going to feel safe to ever say it happened to them as well. So looking at how, each survivor's voice does help shatter that silence. And that's why I think about Tyler Perry going on Oprah's show, and the focus of male survivors in that particular show back then, where the people in the audience were all survivors and were all holding a picture of themselves at the age that they were when they were first abused as children. And just, again, so important to be making sure that we're broadening society's scope of who are victims and how victims are experiencing these types of harm. Similarly with, when you think about Joe Paterno and the Jerry Sandusky situation, people knew that harm against the boys was happening and they ignored it. They 100% ignored it. And Jerry Sandusky had a foundation where he was, helping at-risk youth, which made him look like this, great citizen in the community when he was actually creating just more avenues for him to groom and abuse children. And the pain for the survivors who were hearing, oh my goodness, this great coach, this, football award-winning coach couldn't do something like that, wouldn't do something like that. And so the focus goes on, disbelieving victims rather than acknowledging that this is happening around us every day. Because the part I think that contributes to sexual violence victim blaming a lot is that we don't want to believe that we could just as easily be a victim if we aren't holding the victim responsible in some way. If you hadn't been drinking, if you hadn't been wearing that outfit, right? All of those victim blaming sentiments is part of how we distance ourselves and try to protect ourselves from feeling that we could be just as vulnerable. Raphael, go ahead. Can we unmute Raphael? Raphael. Uh-oh. There we go.
Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Yep.
Yeah, and also just wanted to share, I just saw this not too long ago, a special report, ABC. They reopened a case in Colton High School here in California, which is a powerhouse football factory for college players, where the coach's daughter was the head trainer, and she molested high school football players while they were getting their treatment. And so the sexual assault or aggression can come from any which way. But Joe Paterno, big big time football coach.
Yep.
The local high school trainers are also a mix or can be part of this. So, and it was a female on male aggression. So just Yeah, it was a great report. If you get a chance to take a look at it, and the case has been reopened, and they're investigating.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing. Exactly. And important to be reminding there are female offenders. Absolutely. It makes me think of the Larry Nasser, how many victims Larry Nasser had and how manipulative he was in, again, making it seem like it was part of the normal procedure, abusing his power and authority over all of those gymnasts. By making it seem like part of a normal medical exam and being done right in front of parents in some cases, right? So that's kind of the depravity in the way that a lot of these offenders are moving it can be quite overwhelming. Absolutely, good points. I will briefly just mention if Amanda Berry, Gina De Jesus, and Michelle Knight were the 3 women that were abducted in Cleveland, Ohio, and held captive for years. And Amanda Berry gave birth as a result of one of the times when she was sexually assaulted by that individual. And Amanda and Gina have written a book together. And I raised that you likely are not seeing this as frequently in your work, but important to also think about, as Taisha was saying, when someone becomes pregnant as a result of violence, the decisions to be made there on, do I keep the baby? Do I have an abortion? All of the judgment that is around that. Maybe not living in a state where an abortion is even possible nowadays. Think about all of these weighty decisions contributing to that. And Amanda speaks really beautifully about how how she had to process through what having a child as a result of rape was like. And then also thinking about how in several states in this country still, rapists can file for custody of the child that is born out of that violence. So lots of, again, sorry that it's so difficult and painful to hear, but these are realities for a lot of people. And that maybe that's the experience you have with a mom you're working with, that presently she may be in a loving, healthy, supportive relationship. And she may be really excited about having this baby and having this new life come in, but she may also be struggling with feelings of, the pain from that past trauma that may be making her feel guilty about not being as excited about that baby coming into the world, or where this is where survivors really are holding a lot of mixed feelings and conflicting feelings. Feel free to also throw in the chat. Oh, yes, people are doing that. Other high profile cases that come to mind. Sean Combs, P. Diddy was in the news again this week for not only violence against females, but against a male music producer that he worked with. I think about Donald Trump and the civil case with E. Jean Carroll, with him being found liable for having assaulted her, and all the other comments that Trump has made along the way. So yes, what can we learn from these high-profile cases? Not to sensationalize, but again to really amplify the voices of survivors. Next slide. I also want to just make sure we are recognizing the disproportionate rate of violence against people of color, as well as as Jessica mentioned earlier, for lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual individuals at higher risk because of all of the systemic racism and homophobia and discrimination that is baked into our systems. Into our healthcare systems, into our criminal justice and educational systems, you name it. So we need to be supporting the calls for more culturally sensitive programming and resources and funding for programs that are working specifically with different cultural groups and communities. Next slide. So we're going to get into some more of the trauma responses now, and we want to do another word cloud. So we want you to share reasons that contribute to a survivor not wanting to disclose. What might make them choose not to tell anyone, either a friend or a family member or law enforcement? What are reasons that someone may not report the abuse?
Fear, guilt, shame, threats. Yep. I think threats, real or imagined, that really goes all around. Believing the abuser, fear of retaliation, labeling. Oh my gosh, there's so many. Excellent. Victim blaming. Yep, either directly or as a society, and own myths that we all might carry. Embarrassment, religion, beliefs, whether that is a religion that we're raised in and that person follows and believes to be true, and then also spiritual beliefs maybe separate from the family. Being scared, absolutely.
Believing the
Denial.
abuser.
Believing the abuser, like, okay, maybe it is my fault. They have a point. I'm not going to be believed anyways. Prosecution. I definitely think about that with sex workers, where people think that, oh, well, sex workers can't be raped. That's like part of their job, which is not true. And even within that context, a lot of times they end up being a source of like charged with crimes of prostitution because it's illegal. And so yeah, a lot of fear there. And also of prosecution of like if it's a family member. I guess we'll get into some of these, but
and intimidation also noted. Yeah,
yes.
I mean,
Yep.
Your life being blown up and wanting to maintain your privacy, fear of not being believed. It's heartbreaking when people do expose that level of vulnerability and are shut down, whether it be from family or whomever they're, talking to. And then what message does that send at a community level, at a society level, right? If we are not believing victims. Great responses. You all are very, very thoughtful and well informed in these ways of, again, shaming and silencing victims. So thank you. Let's go to the next slide. So we've been talking about stigma and about victim blaming. Some of the other reasons that people may not report, they may feel and see themselves as damaged goods, right? Some people feel like they won't ever be looked at in the same way, or they won't ever be looked at as anything but a rape survivor. Not wanting people to know about it, a perfectly reasonable feeling and response. Just in addition to the variety of ways that we minimize, we discount, and we fail to believe people when they're telling us this is happening. Next slide.
I was thinking about, I know we're trying to like get through some of this content here, but when you were talking about privacy, of not wanting to share the details, I mean, if you think about how most people don't want their positive sexual experiences on display, obviously it's a normal thing to not want the violent sexual experiences to be discussed and beyond that experience. So
yeah,
anyway,
absolutely.
so
Absolutely. So all of this is part of the societal norms that we are trying to change that create what we call rape culture, where we're making jokes about sexual violence, or we're trivializing people's experience about it, where ignoring what women and girls and men and boys and everyone across the spectrum are telling us is their experience. We're justifying it. Boys will be boys, you know, that mentality, or that's just locker room talk. Instead of validating and acknowledging this is a person's truth. So rape culture is, we can go actually to the next slide where we can see some other examples of how rape culture continues the silencing of victims. Think about how many of you have been walking down the street and someone, you know, was catcalling and whistling, and that unwanted advance. And I know situations where when a woman decides to say, why would on earth would you ever think that would be flattering for me? That negative response immediately turns into an escalation of calling, you know, violence, right? How dare you not appreciate the attention I'm trying to give you? Think about all the ways that people move through the world trying to avoid being raped or assaulted. How, you know, all the lessons we teach primarily girls about don't do this so that you don't get raped versus putting more focus on don't rape in the first place, right? Let's not treat each other and take advantage of people's dignity in this way. So whether it be threats, whether it be videos or photos, whether it be the locker room banter, this is where we encourage all of us to look at how in both our personal and our professional lives can we challenge this? Can we speak up when we hear that joke? Can we speak up when we see someone talking about using an image that was given to them inappropriately? Education and consciousness raising is a big effort here with how we're going to actually reduce the levels of violence and hopefully do more preventing of it. We do a lot of work in the intervention space, but the focus really needs to be on reducing the violence in the first place.
And in the chat, someone mentioned 13 Reasons Why, which is a documentary on Netflix, or a mini series, or I remember watching it too. Props to that if you haven't seen that.
Absolutely. All right, next slide. So this is another higher profile case you may remember with Chanel Miller, who was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner, who at Stanford. And she has also written a very powerful book and had an incredibly powerful victim statement during the trial. This was the situation where she was being sexually assaulted outside, I think behind a dumpster, by Brock Turner and two students who were bicycling by, two international students, which I think is interesting because in my mind, I wonder if the reason they weren't better at being bystanders was because they came from other countries where there's more of a collective responsibility feeling, perhaps. But they interrupted the assault, and the outrage, not only over the violence, the sexual assault itself, really came from the way that the judge talked about and treated Brock as the perpetrator himself. Maybe you remember this. So there on the slide, you see all of the questions that Chanel was being asked as the victim, again, being held responsible for the assault that she doesn't remember happening because she was intoxicated. But the goal here was the judge felt that Brock's standing in society was more important and valuable than Chanel's. And he only gave the perpetrator 6 months in jail, 3 years probation, and lifetime registry as a sex offender. And literally stated that he thought the length of the sentence that he could have given Brock for the sexual assault, witnessed DNA, again, all of these, what you think is a rock solid case, would have created more harm for the young man in his swimming career and the reputation of Stanford. That's rape culture. That's why people don't report. That's why people don't feel that even if I do report, I'm going to have any sense of justice, because justice is hard to attain. And often the result of cases is often not a conviction, but juries being ill-informed and holding the victim to blame. If you get a chance to hear Chanel or read her book, that again, I want to make sure that we are hearing from survivors themselves. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the reminder about consent that we wanted to share with a quick video. Some of you may have seen this. This came out a while ago, but is a great way to help people think about what is consent.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No thank you," then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea, don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they are unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea.
Thoughts about that? Sometimes inserting a little humor into these dialogues helps open up the conversation. Did you find that helpful? The simplicity.
Yeah, simplicity for sure. And we have another hand raised.
I think for me, it kind of reminds me when women go on dates and then the guy pays for the date, and then after they feel entitled to something after the date, or they feel like they expect something, and then if the woman says no, they become violent or they get mad.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. That's so common. Yeah, I think this is a good, I like coffee, that's cute. I think this is a good, again, we're trying to find things that the general public can digest a little bit easier, right? And I love the comment about showing this in schools. I, for one, am an advocate for, we can do age appropriate sexual violence prevention work starting in preschool. And so that is important. We need to be making more of this not a dirty hidden secret conversation, but how do we teach young children body autonomy? How do we teach young children that even though my culture is I need to show respect to my elders by giving hugs and kisses, if I don't want to give hugs and kisses, how do we broaden that respect for individuals, dignities, and respect for elders and culture? I
It
see two
really,
more. Yeah.
yeah, and I just wanted to also comment on Briseda, the last comment that was made, that it was a matter of like undoing the social fabric, right? Like the rape culture aspect of, well, this was here and now there's this expectation. And so I think that also like can be weaved into a lot of prevention and training and just making it more of like into our conversation. So it doesn't end up being that way.
Yes.
And yeah, I think Raphael's hand was up first. Go ahead.
Yes, just wanted to share this really quick. So I did a presentation with LAUSD here in Wilmington, and they were doing a bullying training for parents. And part of the bullying training included a little bit about, kids advancing on other kids, and a little bit of the sexual component to bullying, because some bullying does include that. So
Yes.
it is out there, but I didn't think it was strong enough. But at least they're mentioning it, and they're kind of heading that way.
Yeah. Which
Great,
makes
thank
me
you.
think of bullying that's leading next. The youth that was just murdered, is it Oklahoma?
Oklahoma, yeah.
Right? Being
A non-binary youth.
Yes. Being bullied over the way that they looked, and standing up for themselves ended up resulting in assault and death. Exactly. We need to be, again, expanding the definitions, expanding the conversations. This needs to be happening in every setting, in every discipline. Taisha.
I was just going to speak to consent being taught early on. By the time children get in preschool, I'm a former preschool teacher, there's a lot of things that have already occurred by the time they get into the classroom, even toddlers.
Yep.
And so it becomes very, it has to be more intentional, because historically, classrooms have been taught to be, we're all friends in here, and not normalizing that sometimes we just don't do well with certain people, even in preschool. And so there used to be a culture where some teachers would force children, as part of the conflict resolution, was to hug instead of asking. So it is happening. You have teachers now that are more informed about that. But I think one of the challenges, and I'm just saying for me personally, is working in home visiting. It's different.
Yep.
In a family that believes a certain way, and you have to really, that's a fine line, because really it's a cultural belief and value.
Yes.
And so it takes time. HFA, we can be with them for 5 years. And so it takes time, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think the thing is, for me, thinking about, okay, we can only do so much. The parent is not willing to budge in that area. And going back to home visitors, this can be very heartbreaking, because it's, some things research-based is true and correct, but you also have to respect in a large degree the family culture, and really build that relationship where different conversations and guidance to maybe exploring something different than what they're accustomed to. We have moms that have not shared, or really don't believe they even had a traumatic, violent experience. And so for some, it becomes a part of the norm. And so it's really different. And yes, I love the infant massage classes because it tends to be about narrating to the child so that even the infant may feel like, okay, and watching the cues when something is not feeling well for them.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of what you're speaking to is how do we break through a lot of these myths too, right? As well as showing that respect for that family. You're in their home, and it is not about coming in and saying it should be done this way, right? It makes me also think about good touch, bad touch was well intended, but misinformed. There's things that we have to evolve and continue to expand and find ways of helping be applicable to different cultures and different value systems. Absolutely. Great comments. Thank you. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So again, thinking about the impacts of myths, a lot of the societal norms and things that contribute to rape culture make people feel that they're not a real victim, or it may be really hard to believe that someone who we think is an upstanding member of the community could be committing these violent acts. A lot of times people feel if a weapon wasn't involved, that it wasn't as bad, right? Or if someone's in a dating relationship where they are not having choice about the sexual activity, they're not going to necessarily even think that it should be a choice, right? So thinking about consequences of these myths, how do we break through what is a typical victim or these falsehoods about what victimization should be?
And and to your point earlier, if it was attempted and not completed, that the attempts can be just as traumatizing. There's not like a hierarchy.
Yes.
Still.
Yes, absolutely. Next slide. So this is the reminder here about victimization is starting early in life, for individuals well before they're even in middle and high school. And that when you've been raped as a minor, the victimization and the risk for future victimization for being assaulted in your adulthood rises. And this is where we want to be thinking about how do we, conceptualize this as complex trauma, poly-victimization, being a child survivor and an adult survivor of sexual violence, and how that compounds the impacts that we're experiencing. Next slide. And then thinking about what else is impacting survivors. Are they able to afford the medical care that they need? Are they able to afford the mental health care that they may need? Sometimes in the advocacy and the training I've done over the years, the ways to help move some of the needles here is to talk about the cost to the economy, the bottom line for corporations when people are not coming to work because they have been experiencing trauma. So we need to, sometimes this is what helps insurance companies think better and broader about what should be covered when we again are reinforcing that these types of experiences create needs that come at a cost. So if we're putting more money into prevention programming, maybe they won't be needing to spend as much money on all of these medical services that come as a result of violence.
And then not to mention all of the legal costs that are also incurred in criminal and civil proceedings, even with the smaller percentage that goes through each or both of those avenues. speaking of, moving the needle and really getting the attention of politicians at, government.
Yes. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, we're gonna kind of wrap this section up here with this video that I do want to give a warning is very intense and powerful, but also difficult to hear and listen. So again, this is how we're bearing witness to the stories of survivors. And as Terry reminded me, the sound on this one is lower. So it's up as high as LABBN could get it. You may need to make your sound on your device louder to hear it well.
To the man on the bus, I overheard in conversation tell a woman, presumably a friend, "You are too ugly to be raped." Dear man on the bus, tell the 1 in 5 women of this country that they are beautiful, their 4 counterparts spare torment ugly. Tell the 1 in 3 women of this world that you would not make piñatas of their bodies. Watch morsels of them spill greedily to the famished smiles of your ignorance shaped like bloodthirsty children. How your words hit repeatedly until they broke open like a shattered papier-mâché cradle. Their blood flowed like candy until hollowed inside their jaws mangled into a misfortune from when they tried to scream for their legs torn into a crucifix. Their loud cry of eyes muted. Tell them how beautiful their silence is, dear man on the bus. From smothering catcalls to a quickened pace of trek home, rape with a dress on, rape without a dress on, raped as children who couldn't even dress themselves. Tell them how ugly their consent was. Tell the depression, the unreported. Tell Mahmoudia, a footnote in crimson Iraqi sands, how beautiful the military silence is and how we don't ask and they didn't tell in the name of country. Tell Elizabeth Fritzl how pretty the flame of her skin was that turned her father into a torturous moth of incest until she gave birth to 7 choices that she never had. Dear man on the bus, tell my 11th grade student Lauren that she wanted it, her beauty had them coming. Tell my 7th grade student Michaela that she wanted it, her beauty had him coming. Tell my 3rd grade student Andre that he wanted it, his beauty had him coming. Tell the 8-year-old me that the God in me I loved fiercely was so gorgeous that cousin twice my age wanted to molest the holy out of me, peeled raw until I was as ugly as she was. Rape is a coward that hides his face in the makeup of silence, a murderous fruit that grows best in the shadows of taboo, a Vietnam prostitute with red, white, and blue skin, a murmur of bodies left vacant by the souls that spend years and years and pills and pills and poems and poems and poems and even death trying to learn how to reclaim them. Dear nameless assailant, this bus carries the burden of your stick and blindfold patriarchy heavy on your tongue, Your words are like a monstrous accomplice thrown up from your throat to the 97% that will never see a jail. Dear man on the bus, as these words fall out of your mouth, I pray that no one ever finds your children beautiful enough to break open and make a silent, decorative spectacle out of them.
Any thoughts you want to throw in the chat there? Let's all also maybe take a collective breath because that was intense. Powerful, yes. Difficult to hear, but important to hear. Needed, yes. Thank you, yes. I appreciate us all sitting here being able to be present for that pain. That's, again, how we do our best to support survivors and help make it more a part of the everyday conversations we need to have. Thank you. Next slide. Again, if you need to take a break, if you need to take care of self, if this is bringing things up for you, we understand, and we want you to take the time and care you need. Because that's what being aware of trauma means, right? That we can't ignore that there's so many various ways and things that are creating trauma. We want to do our work, again, ongoing work, to continue to think about other ways we can be more responsive and recognizing responses to trauma. How do we make sure we're being as effective as possible with doing our best to not re-victimize an individual or not re-traumatize them? And how do we also make sure that we're taking care of ourselves? Because inevitably we're absorbing a lot of that energy and that weight when we're working with people with trauma histories. So we're gonna share some ideas for how both practices we can use for work with our families as well as ourselves. Next slide. I think we've talked about a lot of these factors here that not only contribute to someone maybe not feeling safe or able to report violence, but may also be what contributes to why how they describe what took place to them may change over time. They may remember things down the road that they didn't remember when they first reported. That's the nature of how our brains protect ourselves from overwhelming and intense experiences that we don't feel like we can always handle. So it's really important to consider that if someone is adding more to a report, that doesn't mean that they were lying. If things change, if other memories come up from for all sorts of different reasons, that is not evidence of them not telling the truth. But victims have had that experience far too often. So again, these are the considerations for how do we lean on all of the factors in our society to start by believing.
Yep.
Next slide. So there are some commonalities when we're looking at after speaking with survivors of sexual violence and rape in particular, that make up this host of feelings and symptoms that has been classified as rape trauma syndrome. And this understanding came from a social worker and a nurse who started talking to sexual assault survivors that they were seeing in a hospital setting. And the importance here of looking at this is how we help normalize these behaviors and responses, because it's common to feel like your life's been blown up. It's common to feel like you may feel like you're crazy because you don't have control over your emotions or your thoughts. It's common to feel like you're witnessing somebody else's life and distancing from your own reality. So rape trauma syndrome is just a range of emotions, and it can vary from immediately after the violence to looking differently several years down the road.
And that piece of your body not feeling like your body in a way, like you were talking about too.
Yes, absolutely. Next slide. So in normalizing and validating experience, we also want to make sure we are being respectful and acknowledging that each person's experience is unique. So all of these factors, the age and my maturity at the time I was victimized, if I do have a history of previous trauma, the number of assailants involved, the amount of injury I may have sustained, my own personal coping system and personality, my own values and belief system. All of these things, make up how an individual is going to respond, be impacted by trauma and violence, but also how they may be needing additional supports as we're looking at what that journey of healing involves. Making sure we're staying up to date with the resources in our communities, doing as many warm handoffs and warm referrals as possible, not just giving someone a list of phone numbers to call. Really looking at what does it mean based on the relationship to the perpetrator. And again, the importance of cultural, religious, spiritual beliefs that may cause more negative consequences to a survivor's experience, but could also be supportive, protective, and resilience building. That may be a mixed bag for people, as great examples have been shared earlier today. Next slide. All right, time for another word cloud. So we want you to give us examples that come to your mind of responses to trauma: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual. What are different ways that people respond after sexual violence? And thank you for the other comments put into the chat. This is really, really good feedback.
Yeah, suicide, isolation, drugs, alcohol, anger. It's like, how are people coping and managing this influx of, new emotions about a really awful thing? Blocked out memories, not social, kind of that wanting to isolate, be alone, withdrawing, panic attacks, anxiety, numbing, paranoia. Yeah, these are getting a lot. Angry with the world, right? It's like, am I angry at myself? Am I angry at the world? Am I angry at my family, the perpetrator, a lot of systems, a lot of layers potentially. Depression, sleeping too much, or lack of sleep. I love how those were next to one another in the cloud for a minute, because we'll talk also later this afternoon, I think, about, or maybe coming up, of having things be too much or not enough. Is it sleeping too much or not enough? Eating too much or not enough? Yeah. Social, like, are you having a sufficient amount of connection? Are you also having a sufficient amount of alone time, or is that becoming too much and kind of out of balance? So
yeah, excellent.
Great.
Shutting down, that's a good one too. Feeling like you're going crazy. Great responses. You all know your stuff. All right, so let's go to the next slide, please. And Jessica's taking over here.
So just a little time check. Okay, cool. So mind, body, soul, spirit, really hard to tease these apart and say one is separate. They really are interconnected here. And I think this is becomes so clear when talking about trauma, because it is such an intense impact on our systems. And so when we're struggling in a certain way, psychologically, mentally, there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be physical symptoms that are associated with that as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that connection. So next slide. So first up, thinking about physiological, somatic, trying to think of other words that might be tossed out there, but essentially this is your body's response to things that are going on. So there might be change in energy levels where maybe there's kind of like a hyper aroused, like an elevated, excited state of maybe that's where not sleeping enough comes in, kind of keeping oneself busy, being occupied, distracted, doing a lot to as a way to have that trauma or the trauma memory not be so present. It also, as one can imagine or maybe have experienced, that is a huge impact on your system. And so feeling fatigued, feeling tired, drained, all of that can definitely be a common response. Exaggerated startle response. So this is where some like noise or other, like you see something and you like just you startle. It's like it's a physical condition, a reflex essentially that is really at a subconscious level. And after a person experiences trauma, this is a very common symptom where that will occur maybe in kind of less like non-safety issue, sort of like mundane or like typical things that are in a person's life, but there is that that alert reflex that happens. Of course, changes in sexual pains, sexual interests, sexual arousal, sexual responding, like there can be a whole host of things. Of course, I think maybe more common that people can kind of tie that connection when it's sexual violence. Maybe not. But yeah, sleeping, eating, and then internal stuff too. So this isn't just our energy and our muscles and kind of like sense of movement. This is also all of our systems that trauma impacts. And so our digestive tract, our breathing, and the cardiovascular, so your heart and your lungs and moving nutrients and messages around your body, gastrointestinal problems, not necessarily feeling like you are hungry. There might also be like nausea involved. I mean, who wants to eat when you're feeling nauseous? Or if you have diarrhea or constipation, it can be figuring out, do I need more nutrients or not? Like what's going on there? And then there might also be like tremors. So like our neurological system is also impacted here. So kind of along with that startle response, we might have pain or tingling sensations, or also shaking that might be like observed outward shaking, or it could be internally, kind of where the person feels it more, that just so feeling like unsettled. And again, gynecological problems. Having these conversations of what is, sexual violence history or sexual trauma that maybe had been going on for the new parent is going to be really relevant when thinking about carrying a child and being pregnant and giving birth and after, and then caring for a child and recovering from that as well. All right, next slide.
Jessica, Sandy, sorry to interrupt, but I got a private question in the chat.
Oh yeah. Yes.
They're asking, is rape trauma syndrome the same as the person experiencing not remembering what happened, like a mental block of incident?
I don't know. Maybe Sandy can speak to the rape trauma syndrome specifically, and that concept being coined. It definitely is, I think maybe on the next slide, but a common occurrence to have that blockage of memory. So the brains and processing something happening when it's traumatizing, the brain doesn't record that information in the same way or as well, or maybe in some cases not at all. And then if it does record it in a certain way, then when we go to the brain goes back to remember, kind of retrieve that information, it can have a really hard time finding where that was saved or in the proper order of things. And so memory can be affected on a number of different levels that could nerd out and have another training on that too. But so the blocking of a memory or the inability to recall what happened is not uncommon. So yeah, Sandy, would you say that is kind of discussed in the rape trauma syndrome?
Yeah, which I think was developed back in the 70s, and which really is the foundation for everything we know with the neurobiology of trauma now. And again, that's becoming a little more mainstream, right? It's not only psychologists talking about that, but helping connect those dots between why our brain and our memory, how and why our brain is impacted. So I do think that they were seeing that happening for many survivors. And then and think about in your work too, in responding to someone who can't remember what happened. That's a whole other level of devastation. So yes, great question. I do think that they are connected.
They say thank you. That answers their question.
Great.
Cool. So to add to that, then, in addition to memory loss, there can be also intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, so like after the fact, where maybe the thoughts, so flashbacks are like visions or sensations, perceptions that a person might have that were pieces of the traumatic event, where intrusive thoughts might not relate to something specifically that happened, that occurred, but could be just something else related to the fear, terror, shame, disgust, all kinds of emotions, experiences that were involved. And the thought might be thought like words or sounds. It might be like a vision or images that are kind of in the person's mind. Occasionally people will talk about not exactly like a hallucination, like from a sort of like in-brain organic, like schizophrenia type of hallucination, but would be very easily reminded or almost feel as though like sense that they can smell a certain scent that reminds them of the trauma. Having a hard time processing thoughts, concentrating, feeling just generally disoriented, that can happen. A lot of times denial, thinking, oh, well, I wasn't assaulted, or that wasn't rape actually, or it wasn't that bad, or even in some cases like, no, that didn't really even happen, in spite of maybe people around the person recognizing that like there's, your clothes are torn, or you went missing, or you were out, like we found you in this position or something like that. So that a lot of these are ways that our brain is trying to help keep us safe. A lot of how we respond to trauma really gets down into our core evolutionary. The body just needs to keep existing and living. And so breathing and continuing on with like basic life functions, and everything else is kind of the cherries on top that fall away for a while, just to be able to get through this really horrible experience. And so that's also where maybe memory, or just kind of like higher functioning of like understanding what happened, can not be as clear or understood in the same way, because we do have a video on the brain. We'll try to get to that. That explains it probably better than this.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Jessica. No, go ahead.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, just other psychological reactions relating to the emotions kind of that we had talked about before as well. And I think also like rape culture and myths about like related to victim blaming, or how a person is supposed to feel, can really play into those trauma reactions kind of persisting, and maybe sometimes being kind of stuck in that, which is what psychologists would term as PTSD, or people who diagnose.
And I just
Okay.
wanted to draw attention to the violent fantasies or revenge fantasies, because often people feel badly about having those feelings, but they are natural and normal responses as well. Family members in particular may really want to do harm to the person that hurt their loved one. So finding ways to release the anger in appropriate ways, and helping people not get stuck in that place, can be a big part of the work as well.
Yeah, and in a similar vein too, pointing out that sometimes people will have zero interest in sex or intimacy or closeness, and other times a person might have like an urge to re-engage or act out again, or be like more motivated, or in order to have some degree of control and mastery over the event that had occurred. So not necessarily encouraging people to act on that, but the urge or that kind of fantasy there, those thoughts, being in some way a normal response to something that's incredibly not normal and not okay. Okay, next slide. So just a quick note here, you can read all of these things, a lot of these I just mentioned. There's a distinction that can be made between signs and symptoms when trauma is being experienced by an individual. And so the signs are what other people can see and can point out that get expressed. This might be things on purpose because the individual is saying things or is acting in a certain way and interacting. And then there might be signs that come through that maybe the person is not intentionally or directly saying as well, but they can kind of be picked up. Our emotions are there as a communicator, communicates to ourselves what is our relationship with what is going on. And also our emotions communicate to other people on purpose and also sometimes not on purpose. Our face is going to say things even when we're not necessarily paying attention to what our face looks like, as an example. And so the inverse to this is our symptoms are the things that the individual is feeling. Whether or not those do get expressed, put out into the world with another person. And these can also be things that another person might not at all be able to tell and notice and pick up on unless it's explicitly explained. So that's where I think like really asking questions and being open or being more trauma informed and understanding this is a huge array of different ways in which people respond to trauma. And they might be very much like deeply personal and private, and those are the symptoms that we talk about. Next slide. So we'll also talk in the afternoon about specific ways that trauma responses can come up when a person is pregnant or giving birth, having kids. Raising them. And of course, this is obviously a stressful experience for anyone. And so just to really, again, underscore that for survivors of sexual violence, it's like another level of intense and stress and can, a lot of different areas bring up memories, things that reminded them of the assault or the violence or the coercion that they had once experienced. And it can also be an opportunity to have a new relationship with their body, a new relationship with other people, in having a family of their own, undoing or adjusting that intergenerational trauma. So out of this, there can be also a place for that post-traumatic growth as well. Okay, next slide. So some of the responses that could relate to pregnancy, how the body is involved. So a person's body is the mechanism of that assault, of that attack. And so similar parts of the body, like there's pelvic pressure, fetal movement inside, different ways through birth, through holding an infant and have skin-on-skin contact, through breastfeeding, a number of different ways that a mother's body is used in that, and can be thought of as used, right? And so that kind of disconnect, or another area of potential like dissociating between, okay, this is my body and this was a painful memory, and also this is me presently being pregnant, giving birth, having this infant, that can be very paradoxical kind of experiences for that survivor. There's just I'm noticing some chats, making sure I got looking in there. Okay, cool. I think those were answered. Okay, yeah, next slide. And some additional ways that sexual trauma and the trauma responses might show up. Different increased risk of health conditions. So again, pulling in our understanding of ACEs, how things can be compounded and create a higher level of risk. There might, depending on the assault, there might be additional considerations to be made in creating that birth plan and figuring out how to carry the child and birth the child and take care of that infant. Different levels of cortisol in the system, and how does that affect mom's ability to regulate her own self, and then doing that for another tiny human as well, or more than one. I keep thinking our examples are all of single child pregnancies and births in my mind, but this is not always the case. And again, just like the physiological sensations can also be reminders of the traumatic or less pleasant times in their life. And so it can also be difficult sometimes, just like coming to terms with the what the pressure and the sensation means in present as compared to the violent acts. Yeah. Next slide.
So quickly, we just want to, again, connect some of the expansion of the original ACEs research, which is the 10 categories you see in the tree here, to looking at more of what's happening at the community level, not only in other research that's been done to add to other adverse childhood experiences, but really here the connection to all of the work you're doing in public health around social determinants of health, and how poverty and lack of access to jobs or childcare, food insecurity, or violence in the community, systemic and structural racism are all other contributing factors to adversity that are in addition to the individual and home life factors. And then additionally adding in there the number 3 categories with the what's happening to the climate and the disasters that are coming out of climate change, causing people to have to be dislocated, or creating other types of problems with having the resources around, and the devastation that's coming as another type of trauma that we're all facing and dealing with. So this comes from, it used to be ACEs Connection, but now it's PACES with a P connection.com, which is an online group that has a tremendous amount of information, and another good way for you all to be involved and think collectively about how we use what we know from ACEs to also support healing. Next slide. These were some other specific factors when we're looking at what's happening when the process of giving birth is felt as re-traumatizing, and how there is higher risk for survivors of sexual violence to be experiencing postpartum post-traumatic stress. And that's natural, right? That kind of makes sense, but I'd link here to thinking about the additional challenges related to maternal mortality and related to other experiences for women of color in particular, when they're being treated differently, when their pain levels and what they're describing are not being believed, when their access to quality care in the first place is not the same or what it should be. So again, looking at that intersectional lens and how are we paying attention to the compounded trauma that is often experienced for women of color. Next slide, please. Yes, the comments, thank you, in the chat about how we can encourage people to share more of this history and experience with providers so that providers can do more, right? If we don't know, if it hasn't been disclosed, then there's some limitations there, which is part of where our hope today is that we're all looking at other ways of validating and supporting and sharing information, even if a disclosure hasn't been made, right? Even if we don't know that that's the case for some of the people we're working with. But I 100% agree that I'd love to see more ACEs screenings being done, more sexual violence screenings being done. We've improved our IPV screenings. That's happening more regularly, but agreeing, thinking about ways we can encourage people to feel comfortable sharing that information so that providers can be better informed and better able to help. 100%. I'll just mention the piece on this slide that we haven't covered yet is survivors may not feel comfortable with providers that are of the same sex as their assailant was. So being thoughtful around a survivor may not be comfortable with a male physician or care team provider, and vice versa. That, as we said, that this goes both ways. So if you're seeing some of those reactions, but not understanding why, this trauma history may be a way of helping understand that. Next slide. All right, so leading up to lunch, this is the other video that I think does an excellent job of really demonstrating how the toxic stress contributes to the impact of trauma on our brains and our overall functioning. This comes out of Scotland. So we will play this and then get your thoughts.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat? What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are three possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the three parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression. Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress.
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. I can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
Any thoughts or comments anyone wants to share after seeing the video? Let me guess, you're all ready for a lunch break. Go ahead, Raphael.
Yeah, I just wanted to share. So like the first approach to the victim was totally just the facts, ma'am, kind of approach.
Yeah.
But the second approach, now that I watch a lot of crime dramas and stuff like that, that is how they do it. They try to bring the person down, ground them a little bit, and they ask these questions. So it makes total sense. This technique does work. It makes them feel valued, and therefore maybe open up a little bit more to be able to provide information. So now I know crime scenes, dramas on TV work.
Oh yeah, I agreed, because I'm addicted to Law and Order SVU.
Me too. I love Law and Order.
Right, because they put the time and effort into being consulted by people working with sexual violence victims, from clinical to law enforcement. So you're right. I think that this is becoming more commonplace because people are sharing the information and helping look at this. Let's break down these silos of, certain disciplines, get this information, but let's spread it across all disciplines so that we can be enforcing and reinforcing and enhancing all of our community responses.
Right. And by way of getting more information that helps, law enforcement and detectives or medical professionals, that sort of thing. It also, to speak to one of the other comments of being less frustrated, that she couldn't remember when it was the just the facts, ma'am strategy. And so I think it's just shifting that gears. It's more information that is needed to be gathered, and also a lot more validating space, a lot more comfortable and less judged to as if there was some kind of expectation that she is supposed to know certain things, where it was like, well, this was just the experience and it was pretty terrible.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, everybody. Terry, you want to take us into our lunch break? Hopefully people get to do whatever makes your heart smile and take a breather from this.
Thank you so much, Sandy and Jessica again. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your participation. We have reached our lunch break. We're giving you a full hour, so please return here at 1 o'clock. I'll still put up a timer and music for those of us that just leave our cameras on mute. But for those of you that need to log off because your iPad overheats or something, that's totally fine. Just please make sure you come back in by 1, because that's when Patrick and I will start retaking attendance for today. But thank you so much, everyone. Please step away from the camera, take a lunch break. And we will see you all back here in an hour.